Liquidity ratios. All right, these are ratios that just look at liquidity, meaning I think of liquidity as the ability to get and spend money. So we're just talking about the amount of cash that you have available to do things with, and we measure that with liquidity ratios. These are usually the simplest and the first ratios we start with. The current ratio is a very common ratio. It's just the ratio of the amount of current assets to current liabilities. And obviously what that means is current assets are things you have on hand, and we call them current because they're short term, and typically these are things that can easily be converted into cash. We expect them to be converted into cash soon. They're either already cash or we can convert them into cash soon. So things like inventories, accounts receivable, right, and also just plain cash. So those are the main current assets. And then current liabilities are things you have to pay soon. Usually the largest one of these is accounts payable. So you've ordered some goods from a supplier and you've received them, but you haven't paid for them yet. You have to pay for them really soon. Right? And so this is just a measure of how easy it will be for you to pay your short-term debts. Right? The slide here says, would you prefer this to be big or small? Well, obviously you want to be more than one. You'd like to have the ability to pay your short-term debts easily. So you want to have enough cash around that you can do that. You don't want it to be too big though, because you don't want to waste a lot of your resources by keeping cash on hand. You don't want to keep a lot of cash on hand that isn't doing much for you. You want to invest that cash into other parts of the business. So, you want it to be large enough that you can easily meet your short-term liabilities, but you don't want it to be too big. Now, you can't really put a number on that. For some businesses, maybe that correct number is 1.2, and for others, maybe it's 2, right? It kind of depends on the nature of your current liabilities, how predictable they are, and how much volatility there is in these kind of things. So, but we often look at industry averages for this. Or you'll look at a company that is in your industry that has historically been well managed, and you can see how they run their current ratio, and that would tell you an idea of what a good current ratio is in that business, that kind of thing. Yeah, I've got an example here, where you can just see there's no rocket science here. We're just taking one number divided by another. In this case, the current ratio is 1.25, and for that case, it might be good. I've got an example here where if you looked at a company that had a current ratio of 1.25 and then another company that I say has consistently been rated as the most profitable and well-managed company in the industry has a current ratio of 2.25, well, that may cause you to doubt that this company is doing enough in terms of the current ratio. You might say, well, maybe these guys know something that this company doesn't. Maybe they should keep a little higher current ratio. Right? We often will evaluate that thing this way. Okay, another way we can look at these ratios, and you can do this with pretty much all ratios, but the current ratio is often looked at this way, where you look at a trend over time. And if you see this kind of trend over time, where we have ratio starts at 2.2 and that's working its way down, I would be concerned about this trend. Right? Because it's getting smaller and it's getting harder and harder for them to meet their short-term liabilities. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be bad. If for some reason you talk to management here and they said, look, we had found over the years we don't need to keep that much cash on hand, and we made a conscious decision to reduce the amount of current assets we have around, the amount of cash in particular, and inventory perhaps, around, and we're confident we can run at this level, a lower level of current assets, then maybe this is okay, right? But all else equal, if I'm seeing this trend, I'm a little concerned about it just because it's getting smaller. Okay. Going along with the current ratio is the quick ratio. I think of it as exactly the current ratio without considering inventories. And so it's very, very similar to the current ratio without considering inventories. And the reason we take inventories out is because if you're having trouble selling stuff, your inventories start to pile up. right? And the idea with inventories is oh, that stuff we're going to sell soon and we're going to turn it into cash. But oftentimes when you start having problems, you're not selling your inventory, right? Or, if you're keeping too much inventory around and it's not selling quickly enough, you don't know that you're going to turn that into cash in time to meet your current liabilities. So this is just kind of a way of saying, okay, well, taking out the complications from being able to sell this inventory, right? Your other current assets are typically going to be cash and short-term investments that are easy to turn into cash. That's a more precise measure, I guess, a more immediate measure of your ability to meet your current liabilities. All right, so that's why we take inventories out. So we'll often look at that in addition to the current ratio. Yeah, I've got a picture of this thing here. Just an example I thought of. For a time, this is a portable compact disc player from when I was much younger, and these were very popular items for a long time, and they made a lot of money for Sony, and they sold very quickly. But then one day the MP3 came out, and all of a sudden this thing was not. Nobody wanted this thing anymore, because compared to carrying around a small device that will play music files, this is a monstrosity. But Sony still had a plant that was producing these things, and it took them a while to realize, hey, we can't sell these things anymore. And so the inventory of these things just piled up. So if you just look at the current ratio, their current ratio would be really good because they had a huge inventory of these things, but they weren't going to sell them and turn them into cash, right? They probably had to sell them at a loss just to get rid of them. So that's a good example of why we often look at the quick ratio to get a real true measure of how easy it would be for you to pay off your current liabilities. Okay, I've got an example here of Home Depot and Lowe's of calculating their ratios. So we're going to use these as we go along here. So let me, I've got these in a spreadsheet, and we'll calculate the current ratio and quick ratio for these companies. Okay, so I've got Home Depot and Lowe's, and we want the current ratio, which is just current assets over current liabilities, and there's our current assets right there. And then we have current liabilities. Notice these are all on the balance sheet. Right. Liabilities, total current liabilities is right here. And now remember, these are balance sheet items, so we're going to take the average. So for 2018, I'm going to take the average of the 2017 number and the 2018 number, and I'm going to divide that by the average of the current liabilities from 2017 and 2018. Right? So I'm taking the average of both of those items there, and that gets me a current ratio of 1.14, and this is for Home Depot. And again, there I'm just taking the average values there. And I can do the same thing with Lowe's. If we look at Lowe's here, and actually since these spreadsheets are, I'm just going to copy this over since everything's the same. And for Lowe's, I get a current ratio of 1.02. Okay, so, all right, so if we were looking at this, if you're trying to make a judgment here, you would say, well, not much difference here, maybe a slight advantage to Home Depot. Right? These are very close to 1, but notice also these are both very large and right now financially secure companies. And so running close to 1, I don't think is something that concerns them that much, right? They could raise short-term cash if they needed to. And in fact, they probably want to run close to 1 because it's good cash management for a company with the kind of resources and size that Home Depot and Lowe's are. Okay, so that's an example there of the current ratio and the quick ratio and the calculation there. Oh, let's see, we didn't do the quick ratio, so let me skip over there and do that. So for the quick ratio, I'm just going to take, again, I'm going to take the average of the current assets for 2017, 2019, but I'm going to subtract out the average value of inventory for those 2 years. And the inventories are here, so I'm going to take out the average value of inventory for those 2 years. All right, and then I'm going to divide that difference by the average amount of current liabilities. And yes, so for Home Depot, that gets me a current ratio of 0.33. And for Lowe's, that gets me a current ratio of 0.11, right? And those are small numbers. And if you're just looking at this and looking at these businesses, that would concern you. You would say, oh, man, you guys are really dependent on selling your inventory to meet your short-term liabilities. And that's true. But remember the kind of businesses these are. That's kind of how these businesses are designed. They buy a lot of stuff, they put it in the store, and they sell it. So they've got an enormous amount of inventory sitting out there, and that's what they're doing, is selling those products. It's not like I don't know, it's not a manufacturing plant, it's not software development. They're not really doing anything to turn those products into something else. They're just buying up that inventory and then turning around and selling it. So it's reasonable to see that, yes, they've got to sell all this inventory to turn it into cash and meet their short-term liabilities, and that's their whole business, right, is amassing inventory and then selling it to the public. So it's not surprising to me that those are so small. Again, if you were going to try to make a value judgment here just on these simple numbers, you would say that Home Depot has a slight advantage in their ability to meet their short-term liabilities outside of having to sell those inventories and turn them into cash. Just a slight advantage there, but there's not much difference between the two. Okay, so there's examples of those calculations there. All right, so that's for liquidity ratios. I'll do financing ratios in the next video.